My father humiliated me at my own party, but my response left him speechless. He wasn't ready for, uh, the music is loud, the lights are soft, and I'm standing in the middle of a room filled with people smiling in my direction. My hands are slightly trembling as I raise my glass, not from nerves, but from something deeper, something I can't yet name. I'm 30 today. 30 years of trying, failing, rising, and hoping. 30 years of wondering if maybe this would be the moment everything felt right. David planned everything. Every string of fairy lights wrapped around the old beams of our rented barn. Every delicate finger food I used to love as a kid. He even made a slideshow of childhood photos that played quietly on a screen behind the buffet. He did all this not just because he loves me, but because he knows the weight I carry even when I pretend I don't. And then my father asked for the mic. David glanced at me first, silently asking if it was okay. I nodded. Maybe this would be the first time he'd say something kind. Maybe he'd finally say, "I'm proud of you." Just once. He took the mic with the confidence of a man used to speaking, used to being the center. My guests quieted all eyes on him. My stomach tightened. Well, he began chuckling, 30 years old, and still no husband, no grandbabies, and living in a rented apartment like a college kid. At least you've got a man who knows how to throw a party. The room laughed nervous, scattered laughter. My smile stayed in place, fixed, like glass. He kept going. I always thought she'd go into law or business, but hey, graphic design, right? As long as she's not asking me for money, I guess it's fine. More laughter, louder this time. My fingers tightened around the wine glass. I could feel heat rising behind my eyes, but I wouldn't give him that. I wouldn't let him see me flinch. He thought he was being funny. He thought this was a roast, but it wasn't a joke to me. It was a pattern, one that had shaped my entire life. Public put-downs veiled as fatherly banter. He'd always dressed them in charm, wrapped them in humor, but they stung like glass in soft skin. The guests looked uncomfortable. David didn't laugh. He stood behind me, his hand lightly touching my back, grounding me. I felt his breath slow, as if he were silently counting to 10. I envied that calm. I kept smiling, nodding along, swallowing the lump in my throat. I told myself this was just one more moment to get through. Just one more time he'd twist the knife while everyone watched. He ended the toast with, "Here's to 30 more years of figuring it out," and raised his glass high. Everyone clapped. I looked at my mother. She wasn't laughing either, but she didn't stop him. She never does. Someone turned the music back on. Conversations resumed. The moment passed for everyone else. But I was still there, stuck in that spotlight of humiliation. I walked to the bathroom, excused myself with a smile, closed the door, locked it, pressed both hands on the sink, and finally let myself breathe. My reflection looked like a stranger, shiny-eyed, tired, aching. 30 years of this, of bending, shrinking, twisting myself into whatever version might earn his love. And this was what I got. I dabbed at my eyes, fixed my lipstick, and whispered to myself, "Not tonight. Not again." I had no idea yet, but that moment, those words would be the last time I let my father define me. And when I walked back out into that room, everything looked the same. But something in me had changed. I was born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I sometimes wonder if I was already disappointing my father by the time I took my first breath. My mother once told me he'd wanted a boy, someone to carry the family name, someone he could mold into a version of himself. But instead, he got me. A quiet, creative girl who preferred drawing birds in the margins of her notebooks to running around with a football. My name is Claire. I'm 30 now, but for most of my life I felt like a child still waiting for her father's nod of approval. When I was 8, I performed in a school play. I spent weeks memorizing my lines, making sure every word came out clear. My mom beamed in the audience, mouthing the words along with me. But afterward, as we walked to the car, my father said, "It was cute, but you could have spoken louder. Some people in the back probably didn't hear you." At 12, I won a regional art competition. They displayed my watercolor painting of a red-tailed hawk in the school lobby for a month. My teacher called it Beyond Your Age. I rushed home, clutching the ribbon in my hand. My father barely looked up from the paper. "Birds again," he said. "When are you going to draw something useful?" At 17, I got into NYU. It was my dream school, Urban Alive Creative. He refused to co-sign the loans, said it was a waste of money for a soft degree. I went to community college instead. I never held that against him out loud. I just packed that disappointment away like a sharp stone in my chest, one of many. Still, I kept trying. I worked 2 jobs to put myself through school, graduated with honors, started my own freelance business, moved into my own place, all without asking him for a single dime. But that didn't seem to matter. No matter what I accomplished, I was always the one who needed to try harder, to do more, to be more. Meanwhile, my brother Zach, 2 years younger, barely held a job longer than 6 months, was just going through a phase. Every Thanksgiving, my father would toast him. To Zach, he's got guts. He'll land on his feet. Me, I was rarely even mentioned. And somehow I accepted it. I rationalized it, told myself that's just how he is. He means well, he's from a different generation. I swallowed it all down and convinced myself that being the bigger person was some kind of moral badge. But birthdays, those were supposed to be different. Mine were the rare days I allowed myself to believe things could shift, that maybe he'd say something kind, acknowledge my effort, my growth. Even as I got older, that hope never really faded. I think that's the most painful part, because when you stop expecting kindness, at least you can't be blindsided. But I kept expecting. I kept believing that maybe this time he'd see me. Just once. The night after the party, I couldn't sleep. David was already in bed, turned toward the wall, giving me space. I appreciated that more than he knew. I sat in the kitchen, the lights dimmed, sipping lukewarm tea I didn't want. I scrolled through the photos on my phone, pictures of me smiling with guests, hugging friends, laughing with David. I looked so happy, and yet I remembered exactly what that smile was hiding. The nausea, the ache behind my eyes, the shame. My father's voice echoed in my head, twisted into every picture. No husband. Still figuring it out. At least she's not asking for money. What hurt most wasn't just what he said. It was how many times he'd said things like that in different ways over so many years, and how I'd let it slide every single time. I thought about how often I had bent backwards to keep the peace. How many times I'd chosen silence instead of confrontation. How I'd built a life trying to make someone proud who never really wanted to see me at all. I was exhausted from it. There was a journal in the drawer near the fridge. I pulled it out and opened to a blank page. My hand hovered over the paper for a second. Then slowly I began to write. Not poetry, not reflection, just words. The things I would say if I had no fear. If I could open my mouth and let it all out without worrying whether it would ruin Christmas or cause another week of silence. It began with, "You have embarrassed me for the last time." And once I started, the words poured out like floodwater behind a broken dam. I wrote until the ink smudged beneath my hand, until my tea went cold, until the birds outside began to chirp. And when I finally closed the journal, I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. David was already up when I walked into the bedroom, the morning sun just starting to cast light through the blinds. He didn't say anything at first, he just looked at me. Then gently he said, "You didn't sleep." I shook my head. My voice was rough when I spoke. I wrote something. He didn't ask what. He just nodded like he already knew it wasn't meant to be shared yet. David had always understood that some pain isn't meant to be fixed by others. Some pain needs to be bled out in silence first. The days that followed were oddly quiet. I didn't call my father. He didn't call me. There was no follow-up from my mother. It was like the whole scene had been wiped clean from their memory. Or maybe it hadn't even registered to begin with. But I carried it, every minute, every breath. A week later, I returned to work. My clients were kind and oblivious. My deadlines waited for no grief. I smiled through Zoom calls, proofed logo drafts, and spent my nights rereading the letter I had written. It was 5 pages long now. I added to it every evening, sometimes just a sentence, sometimes entire paragraphs. It wasn't a letter anymore, it was a reckoning. I remembered things I hadn't thought about in years. Like when I was 14 and came home crying after being mocked at school for wearing thrift store shoes. My father barely looked up from the game and said, "Well, maybe now you'll learn to work harder." Or when I was 19 and had my first panic attack. My mom drove me to urgent care. My father said, "That's just dramatics. Don't be weak like that in public." Each memory dug up the foundation I'd built myself upon. and I started to see it how the small cracks had been there all along. I hadn't just been hurt, I had been shaped by that hurt, and that made me angry, not the red-hot fury of the moment, but something colder, something quieter, a realization I'd lost years of my life waiting for him to love me right. And in that realization, something within me began to harden, not in bitterness, but in clarity. David noticed the change. One night as we were cleaning up after dinner, he asked gently, "What are you going to do with it?" "The letter." I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "I'm not ready to burn it, but I'm not ready to give it to him either." He nodded again, drying his hands on a towel. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." It was a strange kind of power knowing I didn't have to explain myself anymore, that I didn't need permission to feel what I felt. I had always looked to others to validate my pain. Now I didn't need anyone to tell me it was real. That Friday, my brother Zach called. He sounded cheerful, casual, like nothing had happened. "Hey, Claire. Dad says you've been distant. Everything okay?" I paused, and in that pause, I realized I was done pretending. "You were there, Zach," I said. "At the party." A beat. Then his voice dropped, almost sheepish. "Yeah, I mean, you know how he is." He didn't mean anything by it. There it was, the classic family mantra. He didn't mean anything by it, like that erases everything. "I don't care what he meant," I replied calmly. "I care what it did." He went silent, then muttered something about me being too sensitive, too emotional. He said maybe I was overthinking it. I let him talk. Then I hung up. It was the first time in my life I didn't justify myself. I didn't apologize. I didn't try to make him understand me. I simply chose the silence that spoke for me. That night, I wrote one last line at the end of the letter, "I forgive you," but that doesn't mean you get to keep doing it. I didn't know when or if I'd ever read it aloud, but I knew one day that moment would come. And when it did, I wouldn't flinch. The weeks passed, and with every day of distance, I felt a strange kind of healing settle over me. Not the kind that comes with apologies or sudden resolutions, but the quiet, unglamorous kind. The kind that begins when you finally stop chasing the people who hurt you. I stopped going to Sunday dinners. I stopped answering texts that felt performative, thinking of you from a mother who wouldn't say a word when her husband made her daughter the punchline of a joke. My absence wasn't a declaration. It was a boundary. One Saturday morning, David and I took a drive out of town to a little antique market tucked in a rural corner of Lancaster County. I bought a pale green vase that reminded me of my grandmother. She'd passed when I was 13, the only adult I'd ever felt completely safe with. The vase felt like a tiny reclamation, a small piece of something soft I'd once known. While David paid, I stepped outside for air. That's when I saw them, my parents, sitting on a bench outside the nearby diner sipping coffee like nothing in the world had shifted. They didn't see me, and for once I didn't approach. I watched them for a moment, trying to read something in their body language. Guilt, regret. But all I saw was comfort. Two people who had never been made to reckon with the damage they caused. That moment could have broken me, but it didn't. I realized I no longer needed them to feel what I felt. Their remorse wouldn't heal me. Their shame wouldn't change the past. I turned away before they could notice, and I smiled to myself. That small act, choosing to walk past instead of toward, felt louder than 1,000 confrontations, but life has a way of circling back. 3 days later, my mother called. Her voice was brittle. "Your father's blood pressure spiked." We spent the night at the ER. I waited. Then she added, "He asked if you'd come by. He wants to talk." For a moment, I felt the old tug, that familiar sense of duty, of fear, of hope. But this time, I didn't act out of any of those things. This time, I chose clarity. "I'll come," I said, but on my terms. David offered to drive me. I told him I needed to go alone. The house hadn't changed. Same blue curtains in the living room. Same smell of old carpet and coffee. But I had changed. My father sat in the recliner, a blanket over his lap, his face slightly paler than I remembered. He looked up when I entered, but didn't smile. Neither did I. He didn't start with, "I'm sorry." He never did. Instead, he said, "Your mother said you've been upset." I sat down across from him, calm, straight-backed, still. "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm done." He blinked. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope. The letter, the one I'd written over and over again, refined like a blade. "I wrote something. I need you to listen." He didn't nod, didn't protest, just sat there stunned. I opened the letter and began to read, page by page, memory by memory. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I read each line with a voice as steady as bone. "You mocked me at my birthday. That wasn't new. It was just public. You've made me feel small since I was a child, and I spent my life trying to earn what you never planned to give your respect." His jaw twitched. His eyes flickered, but he didn't interrupt. I kept going. "You ridiculed my choices, my career, my worth. You watched me break myself trying to be good enough, and you called it character building." The room was still. My mother stood quietly in the hallway, listening, frozen. I read every word, until the final lines. "I forgive you, but that doesn't mean you're welcome in the parts of my life where I feel safe. I choose peace now, not performance. And I will never again let you humiliate me and call it love." The last word echoed. I folded the paper and looked up. He opened his mouth, closed it. And then something happened I hadn't expected. His eyes welled with tears. But I didn't reach for him. I didn't try to comfort. Because this moment wasn't about him. It was about reclaiming my voice. And I had just done that fully, finally, forever. He didn't speak right away. His mouth hung slightly open as if the words had evaporated before they could form. He just stared at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something I'd never seen in my father's face. Not anger, not pride. Silence. Pure, stunned silence. I held his gaze, and I didn't flinch. My mother stepped into the room. Her arms were crossed over her chest, but her face, normally tight with worry and endless compromise, had softened. She looked at me like she didn't quite recognize the woman sitting on her floral sofa. "Claire," she started, but I raised a hand gently. I didn't come here to fight. I came to speak my truth, that's all. My father shifted in his chair. His voice, when it finally came, was low, fragile. "I didn't know you felt all that." I let out a slow breath, not cruel, just honest. "You didn't want to know? You never asked." He nodded like someone accepting a verdict they can't challenge. Then he looked down at his hands, the same hands that once taught me how to ride a bike, but never learned how to hold my heart. "I thought I was making you strong," he murmured. "You were making me invisible," I replied, soft but firm, and I believed that was love for far too long. The room swelled with everything unsaid, the broken years, the bruises of words never taken back, the birthdays, the dinners, the 1,000 moments where a little warmth could have made all the difference. "I can't undo it," he said after a long pause. I didn't disagree. I didn't comfort him either. "That's not what I came here for." I stood placing the letter on the coffee table. It wasn't a gift. It was a boundary in ink and paper. As I turned to go, my mother reached out, touching my arm lightly. Her voice shook. "Will we see you again?" "I don't know," I said truthfully. "That depends on what kind of silence follows this moment. If it's the kind that avoids, or the kind that listens." I didn't wait for a reply. I walked to the door, heart-steady steps sure. Each footfall down the hallway felt like shedding a skin that never fit me to begin with. Outside, the air was cool, sweet. It smelled like early spring, like rain had passed, and the world was fresh with possibility. David was parked across the street. He stepped out as I approached, scanning my face with gentle eyes. "You okay?" I nodded. "More than okay." We drove home in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the sacred kind. The kind where you sit beside someone who doesn't need to fill the space with questions because they already know you've just crossed something impossible. That night, I took the letter, my copy, and slipped it into the bottom drawer of my desk. Not to bury it, but to honor it. A monument to the version of me that finally said enough. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation. Not my father, not my mother, not even the past. I didn't need to be their good girl anymore. I just needed to be free. The next morning, I awoke with a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't joy exactly, it was something quieter, a kind of calm that comes when you finally stop bracing for impact. For so long, I had lived in a permanent state of flinch. Now I could stretch inside my own skin. David was already in the kitchen making coffee. He glanced over his shoulder as I entered and smiled. Not a questioning smile, not one that asked, "How did it go?" but a knowing one. The kind that said, "I see you, and I'm proud." I sat down at the table and wrapped my hands around the warm mug he placed in front of me. He slid into the seat across from me, watching my face the way someone might watch a candle that has finally stopped flickering in the wind. "I didn't think I could do it," I said, voice hushed. "I knew you could," he replied. "You just had to know it too." I nodded, tears stinging the corners of my eyes, but these weren't the kind that came from pain. They were soft, grateful like rain after a long drought. That day, I opened my email and did something small but important. I removed my father and mother from my holiday mailing list. No announcement, no spite. Just a quiet decision my future would no longer be built on obligation. I wanted joy to be genuine, invitations to come from a place of peace, not guilt. And in that spirit, I began planning a small gathering, just a handful of friends, David's sister, her 2 kids. People who made me laugh, people who saw me. A week passed. Then one morning a letter arrived, handwritten, my father's shaky script on the front. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside were just a few lines. No grand apology, no excuses. Just this, Claire. "I don't know how to be the father you needed, but I'm trying to understand. I know I hurt you. I'm sorry. If you ever feel ready, I'm listening. Dad." I folded the letter, set it aside, and just sat there. I didn't cry. I didn't rush to respond, because this wasn't about him anymore. This was about me and the home I was building, not with walls and paint, but with choices and peace. I didn't know if I'd ever write back. I didn't need to know right now. Healing isn't a finish line, it's a rhythm. Some days it's quiet and soft. Other days it's loud and bitter. But on this day, it was enough to simply breathe and believe that I could keep choosing myself. Later that night, I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket watching the stars begin to pepper the sky. And for once, I didn't feel like something was missing. I felt whole. I felt home. Time has a funny way of folding itself around emotional distance. You think you're only a few steps away from someone, and then you try to reach for them and realize you're continents apart. That's how it felt with my parents now. They didn't call again. Not after the letter. Not after I didn't respond. And honestly, I didn't expect them to. In our family, silence was always the wallpaper, ever present, just textured enough to blend in. We'd been taught to live with it, decorate around it. But I wasn't decorating anymore. Instead, I was redesigning my entire interior life. The gathering I had planned was small, just as I wanted. Warm lighting, bowls of David's favorite roasted carrots, a string quartet playlist humming in the background. His niece fell asleep on my shoulder after dessert, her tiny hand curled around my necklace like it meant something. And maybe it did. Maybe it meant I was finally being seen not just by others but by myself. Halfway through the night, my best friend Layla pulled me into the kitchen, wine glass in hand. "You're different," she said. "Lighter." I let something go, I replied. "What?" The version of me that thought she had to be small to be loved. Layla just looked at me glassy-eyed and hugged me tight. We didn't need to say anything else. That night, after everyone left, I sat at the kitchen table and took out my journal again, not to write about the past, but to write about the future. I started with a question: what would my life look like if I stopped waiting for people to change? Then I answered it. It would look like boundaries that didn't bend every time someone got uncomfortable. Like saying no without an essay to follow, like protecting my peace like it was sacred because it is. It would look like fewer apologies for things I didn't do, more laughter in rooms I used to cry in, more softness toward myself. I wrote late into the night not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because I was finally speaking to someone who listened me. In the following weeks, things continued to shift. Zach sent a brief text, "Mom says you're mad at Dad again," and I didn't respond. I wasn't mad. I was just done pretending we were all fine. I didn't block him. I didn't fight him. I just didn't engage. That was the real power. Not everything needs a war. Sometimes healing is just a decision to stop entering the battlefield. Meanwhile, David and I started looking for houses. He wanted land. I wanted windows. We compromised on a fixer-upper with both. The first night we stepped into our new home, it still smelled like the people who had lived there before us. But I smiled, knowing that soon it would smell like my candles, my baking hour mornings. And it would be filled only with people who chose kindness on purpose. I didn't hang any family portraits. Not yet. Not because I was erasing my history, but because I was no longer letting it define me. I've learned that not everyone who helped shape you deserves a seat at the table you build. Some people are meant to be chapters, not characters in your final scene. And that's okay. That's more than okay. That's freedom. Spring came early that year. Our new home, nestled just outside the edge of town, had wild daffodils growing along the fence and creaky floorboards that spoke in the night. I loved it instantly. It wasn't grand, it wasn't polished, but it was ours. And more importantly, it was peaceful. David and I painted the kitchen a soft sage green. We built bookshelves from scratch, even though neither of us really knew what we were doing. There was laughter in every mistake. A crooked shelf, a coffee-stained rug. None of it mattered, because the air no longer carried tension. There were no phone calls that left me shaken. No holidays filled with tiptoeing around egos. I didn't even realize how heavy that weight had been until it was gone. One evening after a rainstorm, I stood barefoot on the back porch, watching steam rise off the fence. The letter from my father sat inside, still unread a second time. I hadn't thrown it away, but I hadn't responded either. And that silence was no longer a wound. It was a choice. People like my father assume that silence means punishment, that it's cold or spiteful. But mine wasn't. My silence was protection, a quiet refusal to keep participating in my own belittlement. And somehow I knew he understood that now. My mother texted once to ask if I was okay. I replied simply I am. She didn't ask more. She never did. I don't hate them. I don't wish them harm. But I also don't miss the person I used to be when I was near them. Sometimes I still hear my father's voice echo in my memory, especially in moments of doubt. Don't be dramatic. You're too sensitive. You need to toughen up. But then I remember the girl who stood in front of him with a letter and didn't cry. I remember how steady my hands were, how even my voice sounded. That memory overwrites the others now. In the months that followed, I started mentoring younger women through a local community center, most of them first-generation college students, many of them trying to break cycles in their own families. I didn't tell them my whole story. I didn't need to. But I listened to theirs. And I told them what I wish someone had told me. You don't have to earn love by being smaller than you are. One girl, 18 and still learning her voice, looked at me once with glassy eyes and whispered, "Do you really believe people can heal from this?" I took her hand and answered, "I don't just believe it. I am it." And I meant it. I no longer needed a father to stand up and toast to my worth. I had found it myself in the quiet of a rented apartment, in the ink of a hard letter, in the arms of a man who never made me beg for gentleness. Healing didn't come all at once. It came in moments. In the scent of fresh-baked bread on a Sunday. In planting a lilac bush just because I loved the smell. In turning off my phone on my birthday without fear of who wouldn't call. These were the bricks in the new home I was building, not the house my life. And every choice I made now was a love letter to the woman I had fought to become. She was not the version my father understood, but she was finally beautifully fully mine. It was a quiet Tuesday in late summer when I received the voicemail. The tone in my mother's voice was unlike anything I'd heard from her before, tired, brittle, with a tremble she didn't bother to hide. She said my father had been taken to the hospital again. Something with his heart. He was stable, but the doctors were concerned. She said he was asking for me. She didn't say please. She didn't beg. She just said he keeps asking for you. I sat with that message for a long time. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I needed to make sure that whatever decision I made, it wouldn't be out of guilt. I'd built too much peace to hand it back over to the very hands that had torn it apart. That night, I told David everything, not just about the voicemail, but about the flicker of curiosity I felt. Not hope, not obligation, just a gentle nudge from somewhere inside me whispering, "You're strong enough now to visit without losing yourself." And so the next morning I drove. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. My steps echoed in the hallway as I approached the room. He looked smaller in the hospital bed, not just physically, but in spirit, like someone whose voice had once filled a house but now barely carried across the room. He looked up and saw me. His expression didn't shift into surprise or remorse. It settled into something else. Relief. "Claire," he said, his voice dry, paper thin. "I didn't sit. I didn't move closer. I got your letter," he continued. "I've read it. probably 50 times. I stayed by the door hands at my sides, listening. I didn't know I made you feel that way. I met his gaze, but you did. He nodded slowly, eyes moist. I didn't know how to be gentle. I thought if I pushed you, you'd become strong. I did, I said, but not because of you, in spite of you. He blinked, swallowed hard. I don't expect you to forgive me. I tilted my head, but I already did. That was for me. He closed his eyes and nodded again, a deep exhale leaving his chest like something long buried being finally surrendered. I looked at the monitor beeping steadily beside him. Then I said something I never imagined I would. I hope you find peace, Dad. Not just in this hospital, but inside you. Wherever that lives. I turned to go. Claire, he called out just before I stepped into the hallway. I paused. Thank you for coming, he said. I nodded once, not with warmth, not with hate, just with truth. And then I walked out, light on my feet, untethered. I didn't cry on the drive home. I didn't feel triumphant either. I just felt clean. Like I had finally washed off a layer of grief I'd worn so long I mistook it for skin. Back at the house, David met me with a cup of tea and a long embrace. No questions, no demands. Later that evening, I sat on our porch swing watching the light shift into gold across the backyard. And I thought about how far I had come from the girl mocked at her own birthday to the woman who didn't need her father's love to know her own worth. Sometimes healing doesn't roar. It doesn't announce itself in grand gestures. Sometimes healing is just a quiet goodbye in a hospital room spoken not with vengeance but with grace. And sometimes that's enough. A few weeks later, I received the call I knew would come. My father had passed. It was early morning, the sun barely cresting over the trees outside our bedroom window, when my phone rang. My mother's voice was flat, not emotionless, but stunned, like she hadn't quite caught up with the reality she was delivering. He's gone, she said simply. Last night in his sleep. I didn't collapse. I didn't feel that jolt of devastation people talk about when they lose a parent. What I felt was more complicated, like a hallway of doors I'd already closed had finally quietly locked behind me. I offered my mother my condolences. I meant them. I asked if she was alone. She said Zach was with her. There was a long pause, and then he left a letter for you. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. A few days later, a small envelope arrived, my name in his handwriting, shaky but deliberate. Inside were two things: a note and a folded, faded drawing. The drawing was mine, one of the red-tailed hawk watercolors I'd painted in middle school. He had kept it, for decades. The note was short. Claire, I don't know if I earned your forgiveness, but I know you deserved better than what I gave. That hawk you always drew them so free. I see now I never let you fly. I hope someday you will. Dad. I traced the edge of the drawing with my fingers. The paper had yellowed with time, but the colors were still strong, vivid rust reds, deep mahogany strokes in the wings. I remembered painting it in silence, hoping back then it would be enough. Now I looked at it and smiled. Not because he had finally seen it, but because I finally had. The funeral was simple. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Letting go didn't require a podium. Afterward, people murmured kind things. Family friends I hadn't seen in years told me how proud he'd always been of me. I smiled politely, but said nothing. I knew the truth. I also knew it no longer had power over me. When we got home that night, I framed the hawk and hung it in my office. Not because it reminded me of him, because it reminded me of me, the girl who painted freedom before she ever understood what it meant. Now I was that hawk. I had flown away from guilt, away from the need to prove anything, and toward a life I built myself. A life rooted in kindness, not performance. In joy, not appeasement. In peace, not silence. And somewhere deep in the quiet spaces of my heart, I hoped that whatever came after this world, he had finally found what he never gave himself in this one. Stillness, understanding, maybe even softness. But I didn't wait for that answer, because I had already chosen to live mine. Fall settled over Pennsylvania like an exhale, cool mornings, slow, amber evenings, the trees shedding what no longer served them. I often walked through our backyard barefoot, listening to the leaves crunch under my heels, letting the season carry me forward without fanfare. The framed hawk stayed on the wall above my desk, and sometimes when I paused mid-email or sat sipping tea in the middle of a quiet afternoon, I'd glance up at it not for validation but as a reminder. I had survived. Not just the party, not just the public humiliation, but the decades of dismissal that came before it, the constant ache of trying to matter, the invisible heaviness of shrinking myself to fit into someone else's idea of enough. And now I was done shrinking. One morning, while sipping coffee in my robe, I pulled out the old journal where I had first written the letter to my father. It felt heavier than I remembered emotionally and physically. So many nights etched into its pages, so much pain carefully laid down like bricks in a foundation I didn't realize I was building. I flipped to the very last page, blank. I smiled. I picked up my pen, and for the first time I wrote not to him, not to anyone else, but to me. Claire. You did it. You broke the cycle without breaking yourself. You held your ground. You found your voice. You walked into the fire, and instead of burning, you glowed. You didn't become bitter. You became better. I'm so proud of you. I closed the journal and held it for a moment before placing it in a small wooden box I kept on the shelf beside my desk. Not to forget, but to honor. Because the truth is, I don't need reminders of the pain anymore. I carry the proof of my healing in how I speak now, in how I rest, in how I love. David and I made it a tradition to celebrate my birthday quietly after that. No big gatherings, no speeches, just a weekend away somewhere peaceful by the lake or in a cozy cabin or even curled up on the couch with takeout and music. One night, wrapped in blankets under a sky full of stars, he looked at me and said, "You know I never met your father properly, but somehow I feel like I watched you bury a ghost." I turned to him, took his hand, and whispered, "That's exactly what it was." We didn't say more. We didn't have to. Some grief isn't about mourning who someone was. It's about grieving the version of yourself who kept hoping they'd change. I had grieved her, and I had let her go, and in her place stood someone softer but stronger, someone who no longer needed to be told she was enough. She already knew, the final piece didn't come in the form of a letter or a tearful reunion. It didn't come with flowers at my door or some poetic apology whispered at sunset. It came quietly in the most ordinary way imaginable. I was baking. A simple apple tart, something I'd made 100 times before. The windows were open, letting in the scent of falling leaves and chimney smoke from a neighbor's house. The kitchen was warm, filled with cinnamon and butter and the hum of a quiet playlist. And in that moment I realized I wasn't thinking about him. Not my father. Not my mother, not the past, just the tart and the silence and the peace of the life I had fought to build. Healing had settled so deeply into my bones that I didn't even notice it anymore. It had become the background music of my days, the soft rhythm of routines unburdened by resentment. I pulled the tart from the oven, set it on the windowsill to cool, and stood there for a long time. No urgency, no aching, just breath. That night, as David and I sat across from each other, forks in hand, I asked him, "Do you ever miss your parents?" He looked thoughtful for a moment. Sometimes, but not the version they were in the end, just who I hoped they'd be. I nodded. Yeah, me too. I didn't miss my father. I missed the idea of one. The man who would have clapped the loudest at my art shows. The one who would have called on birthdays just to say, "You're doing great, sweetheart." The man who would have made me feel chosen, not tolerated. But I had learned to mourn the idea, not the man. And in doing so, I made room for something real. I now had people in my life who did clap loudly, who did call just to check in, who didn't twist my worth into a performance. I had created a chosen family, friends, clients, neighbors, even strangers who became something more through kindness and presence. I had chosen myself, and from that choice bloomed an entirely new garden. Sometimes I wonder what my father would think if he saw me now. If he'd recognize the woman I became. If he'd understand that it wasn't in spite of him or because of him, but because I made a choice to stop handing my story over to people who never bothered to read it. I'll never know, and I don't need to. Because here's what I do know. I am not broken. I am not bitter. I am not the girl who needed a man with a microphone to tell a room she was worthy. I am the woman who stood in that room broken-hearted and humiliated and walked out whole. And I never went back. It was my 31st birthday when the final thread loosened. No party, no performance. Just me, David, and a picnic blanket beneath a wide maple tree at the edge of the meadow behind our home. A soft breeze played with my hair and sunlight dappled our faces through the leaves. We ate peach slices and honey-drizzled bread, our fingers sticky with sweetness. No one toasted me. No one made jokes at my expense. There was no spotlight, no awkward silence afterward, no forced clapping. Just laughter. Real round laughter that rose from my belly without fear of being misunderstood. And that's when I realized I had outgrown the version of love that came with conditions. I had outgrown the spaces that required my silence for peace. I had outgrown the need to prove I was good enough. In fact, I had stopped measuring myself altogether. That evening, David handed me a gift, a small hand-bound leather journal. The first page had only one sentence written in his familiar handwriting. Now that you've told the story of what happened, write the story of what comes next. I stared at the page for a long time. Because I finally could. I didn't need to write through pain anymore. I didn't need to bleed into the margins just to feel seen. I could write from joy, from power, from presence. That night, after he fell asleep, I stepped outside with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The stars were sharp and bright, each one a little lighthouse in the black velvet sky. And in the quiet of that night, I let myself whisper one last thing, not to him, not to the past, but to the woman I had become. You are not the things he couldn't say. You are the things you learned to believe anyway. It's strange, isn't it? How someone can tear you down for years without ever raising their voice. How they can live in your head long after they've stopped speaking. How shame seeps into the cracks until you mistake it for your own reflection. But it's not. It never was. And once you realize that, the air tastes different. The world opens wider, and you no longer walk with your eyes cast down, waiting to be called forward. You stand. You speak. You choose. And most of all, you stay gone from the places that once required you to disappear. Winter arrived quietly, without ceremony. It didn't sweep in like a storm. It crept in soft and clean, laying a hush over everything. Our little house was cocooned in white. David strung warm lights around the porch, and I filled the rooms with the scent of cinnamon and clove. There was peace in every corner, and for the first time in years, the holidays didn't feel like a countdown to conflict. I didn't send a Christmas card to my mother. I didn't attend the annual family dinner. And no one called to ask why. The silence was confirmation they had finally understood that I meant it. That this new version of me, the one who chose herself, wasn't a phase. It was a homecoming. David and I exchanged simple gifts, a book of poetry, a hand-knit scarf, a framed photo of the hawk painting now placed in his home office too. Tokens of a love built on understanding, not performance. One night as we lay in bed listening to the wind whistle outside, he turned to me and said, "You know, you're not like anyone I've ever known." I smiled into the dark. Neither am I. Because who I had become wasn't someone I'd met before. I had carved her from everything I wasn't allowed to be. I had built her from brokenness, mended her with grace, and filled her with a softness that survived the fire. She wasn't perfect. She didn't need to be. She was free. In January, I was asked to speak at a small women's retreat, a community of survivors, artists, and quiet warriors like me. I didn't write a speech. I brought the journal, the old one, the one with the letter, and I read pieces of it aloud, not for sympathy, but for solidarity. I watched tears fall, heads nod, hands find each other. Because that's the thing about pain, it isolates us until we name it, then suddenly it connects us. Afterward, a woman approached me. Her voice trembled. "How did you stop needing them to love you right?" I looked at her with all the honesty I had. I didn't. I just stopped letting their failure define me. And I meant every word. I drove home that night in quiet snow headlights carving soft shadows through the trees. My chest didn't ache. My throat didn't clench. All the old ghosts were behind me now, not banished, just quiet. I had outgrown their hauntings. I was no longer the girl who stood frozen while the world laughed. I was the woman who walked through humiliation and kept going, who laid her grief down like stone and built something better on top of it. And somewhere between the heartbreak and the healing, I became someone I'm proud of. Someone my younger self would run to and never want to leave. It was a spring morning, bright, almost obnoxiously so, when I stood on my back porch and realized I was happy. Not distracted, not keeping busy, not performing wellness for the comfort of others. I was actually happy. The kind of happiness that hums beneath your skin like a quiet song. The kind that doesn't need to be posted or explained. Just lived. I'd spent so long chasing peace, trying to fix what was broken in my family, patching over old wounds with polite smiles. And in the end, the peace came not from winning that battle, but from walking away from the war. My mother hadn't called in months. I didn't expect her to. Whatever warmth existed between us had long since cooled into something distant and brittle. I didn't hate her. I didn't wish her harm. I just didn't want to carry her silence like a debt anymore. And that was okay. Some relationships end quietly, not with a bang, but with a door you no longer bother to knock on. David joined me outside with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to me and leaned on the railing beside me, our shoulders barely touching. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. I looked out at the wildflowers just beginning to bloom along the fence. "I think I finally understand," I said softly, "what people mean when they say peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the presence of wholeness." He smiled but said nothing. He didn't need to. Later that day, I pulled out the new journal, the one he'd given me on my birthday. I flipped to a blank page and began to write again. But this time, it wasn't about pain. It wasn't about him. It was about me. It was a letter to the next version of myself. "Dear Claire, you did more than survive. You softened when you could have hardened. You forgave without forgetting. You left without slamming the door. You built a life so gentle and strong that the past no longer echoes here. I hope you look back with pride, not because of what you endured, but because of what you refused to become. You were always enough. You just needed time to believe it." I closed the journal and held it against my chest. The sun warmed my face, the breeze tangled in my hair, and in that moment, everything, the shame, the silence, the sharp sting of that party felt like a lifetime ago. Because it was... And I had walked so far from that night that I could no longer hear the laughter, only the sound of my own voice, steady, clear. Finally mine. The final chapter wasn't a moment at all, it was a season. A long stretch of days where nothing dramatic happened. No letters arrived, no calls from the past. Just the slow, steady rhythm of a life that no longer waited for apologies to begin. I filled my time with small joys. Morning walks with warm tea in hand, teaching watercolor workshops at the local library, reading novels under heavy quilts while the rain tapped gently against the windows, laughing at nothing in particular with David, letting silence stretch without fear it would turn into something sharp. This was the reward no one tells you about. Not revenge, not recognition, not an apology that finally arrives wrapped in remorse. But this a life no longer lived on the edge of someone else's expectations. Sometimes when I see red-tailed hawks circling above the open fields, I smile. I used to paint them as a way to escape. Now I understand I was painting something I hadn't yet become. I was painting freedom. A few months ago, I was asked to give a talk at a small college. The event was called Women Who Rebuilt Themselves. I stood before a room of bright-eyed students unsure of what they expected. I didn't bring notes. Just my story. I told them about my 30th birthday party, how humiliation dressed as humor tore something wide open in me, how the father I tried so hard to impress never saw me. Not really. How I used to believe that if I was just better, kinder, more successful, he'd come around, but that he never did. And then I told them this. I stopped waiting for someone to declare me worthy, and I started being worthy in my choices, in my silence, in my boundaries. You don't have to fight to be seen. You only have to stop shrinking. The room was still when I finished, and then a slow clap, a few tears, then many. Afterward, a girl approached me and asked, "What happened to him?" I paused. "He passed," I said, but he'd already been gone a long time before that. She looked confused. "So you never got closure?" I smiled. "I did. I just gave it to myself." That's the secret. Closure isn't a door someone else closes for you. It's the moment you stop reaching through it, hoping they'll finally open it the right way. It's the moment you let the silence stand and no longer feel the need to fill it. The last entry in my journal reads, "I no longer mourn what never was. I celebrate what is. I am not her anymore. I am me. And that is more than enough." And it is. It truly is. I often think about that night, my 30th birthday, the clink of glasses, the laughter laced with cruelty, my father's voice echoing above it all like a gavel. There was a time when that memory would have gutted me, but not anymore. Now I see it for what it was, not a breaking, but a beginning. The moment I stopped performing for someone who never clapped for me. The moment I turned inward and found something still intact, still glowing, something I could rebuild from. I look at my life now and it feels like it belongs to me, every part of it. My mornings, my choices, my voice. I don't edit myself anymore to make people more comfortable. I don't hand over the microphone to people who weaponize it. And I no longer confuse family with safety. Somewhere along the line, I realized that love without respect is just control dressed in tenderness. And I had known that flavor of love for far too long. Now love means quiet dinners where I don't brace for judgment. It means friendships where I can cry without being called dramatic. It means a partner who doesn't rescue me but stands beside me while I rescue myself. David once said, "You live like someone who learned to breathe underwater." He's right, I did. Because when you spend years submerged in silence and shame and you finally break the surface, every gasp of air feels sacred. And this life I've built is nothing short of sacred. Not because it's perfect, not because it's loud or glamorous, but because it's mine. If I could go back and whisper something into the ear of that girl who smiled through her own humiliation, I wouldn't warn her. I'd just tell her this. You won't stay there. You won't stay small. One day you'll stop waiting for someone to choose you and you'll choose yourself. And that day, that's the day everything begins. There's a moment I return to sometimes quietly in my own mind when I'm folding laundry or watching steam curl from my tea. It's the moment just after I walked out of that birthday party. My heels clicking on the pavement, my breath caught somewhere between my ribs and my throat, the sound of distant music still carrying through the door behind me, my father's words bouncing in my chest like loose debris. Back then, I thought that walk to the parking lot was just escape. Now I know it was a crossing, a sacred threshold between the girl I had been aching for approval and the woman I was about to become. That's how most transformations begin, isn't it? Not with lightning, but with quiet refusal. That moment lives inside me now as a reminder that the most powerful thing I ever did was not scream, not fight, not collapse. It was to walk away upright, carrying nothing but my dignity. Because sometimes walking away is not about weakness. It's about knowing you've already stayed too long in a place where love was conditional, where praise was performance-based, and where your softness was mistaken for weakness. I used to think healing would feel like fireworks, but it feels more like this, like mornings that begin without dread, like sitting in silence without trying to fill it, like saying no and not flinching when it lands, like seeing your reflection and whispering, "You're not too much. You never were." There's a certain kind of peace that only comes after the storm, the kind that doesn't shout. It settles in your bones. And now it lives in me? My story didn't end with revenge. It ended with release, not to forget, but to be free. Spring turned to summer. The wildflowers in the yard grew tall and unruly, just how I liked them. Bees hovered lazily around the lavender I'd planted in April. The air hung thick with warmth and a softness I never used to allow myself to feel. I was finally in a season of ease. One morning, I sat on the porch with a cup of chamomile tea, the breeze tugging lightly at my hair, and I found myself thinking not of the pain, not of the humiliation, but of the distance. The beautiful, healthy distance I had placed between myself and the people who once made me question my own worth. That distance had become a sanctuary. I didn't need a final scene, no dramatic confrontation, no moment of public justice. The most powerful resolution I ever gave myself was silence, the kind that didn't ache but healed. Sometimes justice isn't loud. It's choosing peace when your past would have chosen chaos. It's not proving them wrong, it's proving yourself right. It's growing into the person you were always meant to be, far beyond the reach of their smallness. And that's where I stood now, beyond the reach. I looked back once more, not with longing, not with resentment, but with deep, unshakable clarity. They humiliated me at my own party. But I responded not with rage. I responded by building a life so full, so honest, so grounded that not even their absence could haunt it. That was my answer. That was my roar. and they were never ready for it. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, I want you to know something. You are allowed to outgrow the people who raised you. You are allowed to mourn the love you deserved and never received. And you are allowed to protect your peace even when it makes others uncomfortable. This wasn't the ending I imagined all those years ago when I was trying so hard to earn my father's praise. Back then, I thought resolution meant reconciliation, that one day he'd wake up, realize how deeply he'd hurt me, and say the words I'd waited a lifetime to hear. But that day never came, and it turned out I didn't need it to. Because healing isn't waiting for someone else to change. It's changing the way their absence no longer breaks you. It's choosing softness where hardness once ruled you. It's standing in your own skin and whispering, I deserve to be here. So if you've been holding your breath, waiting for the apology, the recognition, the phone call that never comes, I want you to know there is life after that. There is love after that. There is you after that. And the most beautiful thing, that version of you, the one who rises from the ache and keeps going, she doesn't need anyone's permission to begin again. She just needs you.